what exactly is the future of the US dollar? How do we think about investing with our US dollars in light of what Saudi Arabia just did? So if people haven't been following this, Saudi Arabia is kind of like, gee, we don't want to have all this exposure to the US. And I wonder, even though Saudi is an ally, if they're looking at what's happened, say, with Russia and the ability of the U.S. to say, you know what, we're cutting you off, right? We're not gonna take any trades in nat gas, and rubles are no longer exchangeable here. Is this what other countries are worried about right now? And what does that mean for the dollar's safety, and for the hegemony of the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating topic. So there was this story from last week, I believe, that the Saudis were ditching an agreement with the U.S. That required them to conduct all business in dollars. Having looked into that, it's not totally clear to me if there wasn't. There's a lot of questions around like kind of the veracity of that story or what really happened, whether there was an agreement at all. So to me, it's a little bit ambiguous what actually occurred. But I think
let's not split hairs on that. Let's not the facts get in the way of a good story. No, I'm teasing, but. Even, all that aside for a second, right?
Yep.
We're looking at central banks, and you and I were just looking at a chart of central banks all over the world. Central banks all over the world saying, you know what? We are going to diversify out of the US dollar. I mean, let me see if I can show people this here. Here we go. Okay. Haha. Trish got a chart up. So these are official holdings in official reserve assets. And if you look, I want to say this is around 2010, central banks around the world started increasing what they were diversifying. They were diversifying, I should say, into gold. Why is that?
Well, yeah, I guess that was, around the financial crisis. When you go back to the sort of the late 90s, the sort of the prevailing perspective, and then we see it as all the way down through the financial crisis. The prevailing perspective was that gold was sort of, the so-called barbarous relic, and it was a silly asset and low tech, and, central banks, everyone was sort of getting rid of it. And now after the financial crisis, I guess that was really the catalyst, the mindset.
That's interesting. Changed. That's interesting that it would have been the 2008, right? Because again, I don't have the precise year there, but Rob, it looks like around 2008, it was at the low. So that must have been the year. And then all of a sudden, boom, 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 boom. I mean, we're not back to where we were, say, in 1965, right?
Well, that was during the gold standard, though.
You're right. You're right.
So they're accumulating gold, and I think they'll keep accumulating gold. I mentioned the Saudi de-dollarization story. Whether or not whatever actually happened there is a little bit irrelevant, because the bigger picture is, there is this push among emerging market countries, among the BRICS, to figure out a way to get out of the, American financial hegemonic problem, right? So I think it's very interesting. A couple of weeks ago, there was a BRICS meeting that took place in Russia. Everybody attended, obviously Brazil, China, India attended, right? So people were talking about, is our policy in Ukraine going to drive Russia and China together? India is now, tight with them as well. And who else sent a delegation? The Saudis, right? So Saudi Arabia is now getting closer to the BRICS. So I look at this as a bit of a backfire in terms of what our whole Ukraine policy was. If you rewind a couple of years, we would have expected Russia to be marginalized, and that our sanctions were going to just kind of make them a pariah within the international community. Now, 2 weeks ago, they're hosting a BRICS summit. The Saudis are going. All of these countries are trying to figure out workarounds, trying to figure out how do they develop monetary, frameworks and trading systems that aren't reliant on the dollar, where they don't have to put where they don't have to hold as their reserves U.S. treasuries that are, could either be frozen or can just become less valuable as we fail to solve our entitlement problem, another topic we've discussed.
Yeah.
So I
So
look at
that
this.
brings us to, not to step on you, but I want to make sure that Peace of Mind gets his questions answered too, because, the ways to diversify include gold, obviously, but also maybe digital currencies. I mean, I think that's kind of a dream, if you would, of some of these EM places, emerging market countries, and some have sort of tried it, but it's also tricky in that comes with its own set of challenges. I mean, I think the advantage you have, and by the way, like I like Bitcoin. I remark on how I was the first reporter to actually ever cover. It wasn't that long ago. It was the first time back in 2012 that they ever took Bitcoin as legal tender. And there was a great kid named Charlie Shrem, who actually wound up getting put in prison by the feds because they really, really didn't like Bitcoin. Like back in the day, there's one guy. What was it, Dread Pirate Roberts? Some of you guys that are watching may know him. I remember talking to his mom because he wound up going to prison. He's still in prison, by the way, because he was using Bitcoin as a way of transacting on the deep dark web, so to speak. He actually wasn't like buying or selling illicit substances, but people were using Bitcoin to do so. And somehow he was like a middleman who got trapped up in that. I mean, like this was back in 2012 when Bitcoin was going for basically $100 a coin and nobody knew what to think about it. And I was like, this is amazing. So I was there the first time. Charlie Shrem, who owned the bar in New York City, young guy in his early 20s, was like, is this not cool? And I'm like, this is super cool. It was like, Bitcoin for beers, just to bring it full circle, right? Back to Bud Light. But this is Bitcoin for beers. You could actually use this as legal tender. And now it's increasingly become that way, Rob. And so people say, wait a second, is this really the future? I mean, what do you think as we look, I don't know, 20 years out? Bitcoin is certainly, I mean, it's no longer $100 Bitcoin. I don't know where we are right now. What is it, like 40K?
I don't know.
Somewhere in that. I'll find out. Yeah. I'll find out. But I mean, look, and it's become so mainstream, if you would, like,
Right. And they had the ETF conversion, which we wrote about a bit in the 76 report. And look, my personal view on Bitcoin, I do own, I got into Bitcoin via when the ETFs were or when they were back when the GBTC was a trust and we're trading at a big discount and Bitcoin was down and out going back a couple of years. Look, it's very uncertain. It's very volatile. I do have a little bit of exposure personally to it, because.
What am I talking about, by the way? You guys the viewers are going to get mad. Let me just be very clear. 64,000. Okay, $64,744.
And it's held in there.
I should have loaded up back in 2012. Right. What was I thinking? Okay, keep going.
Yeah. No, look, I mean, Bitcoin, Jamie Dimon called it a pet rock. I mean, look, I think it's more than a pet rock at this point. I think it's widely owned. It's institutionally owned. Who knows where it's headed next. There is a case that it's going to become kind of the new, it's digital gold. Everything will standardize around it. And you fast forward 10 years, Bitcoin's going to be worth even more, perhaps considerably more. And it's going to play a role in this new kind of global monetary architecture. I think technology and crypto and blockchain technology is part of what these BRICS countries are really working towards in terms of figuring out, and gold as well, because there's discussion that gold will, whatever solution, technological solution.
You can have a kind of digital gold, if you would.
Or that it'll be some sort of mechanism that's gold backed. So, when you think about both Bitcoin and gold in an environment where most of the world's population is trying to extricate itself from American financial dominance or G7 financial dominance. Just structurally, it's like an interesting trend. I mean, these BRICS countries are like half the world's population. Their growth rate is significantly higher than the G7. The G7 real growth rate is something like 1%, and the BRICS countries are like 3.5%. So, not to be negative towards the U.S., but there's a lot of people and a lot of economic growth and a lot of advancement occurring in these economies, and they don't like being abused. And we've sort of driven them to the point where they're kind of teaming up, even despite all their historical differences. You think about India and China; they're teaming up and saying we want our own system. We want some respect here.